I'm very happy to be here. I was given two explicit instructions for when I got on this stage. Number one was be honest. And honestly, as someone who used to live here for a very brief stint in 2014, it's very refreshing to come back to a place that is so welcoming of different ways of thinking and different ways of living. And I would say that I have taken note of the way that you live here in Berlin, and much of that has traveled back to the United States with me in spirit. I also am very honored to stand on the same stage as such dynamic thinkers and doers. My only criticism or my only sort of feedback for next year's conference is please invite more white people. I'm glad you guys think that's funny. Okay, woo! All right. They don't like that joke at home. So the second stipulation I was given by my friend Leah, who invited me to be here, was to speak personally. You know, don't come up here and espouse theory about mutual understanding and human differences. Talk about things you've actually been through. And art found me because I had given up on a few other ways of trying to express myself and in trying to be seen and be heard where I live. I was educated in high school in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., about 2 hours south of the Mason-Dixon line, about 15 minutes out of the city, away from the capital, maybe a 2 or 3 hour drive to the Atlantic Ocean. So we were a really peculiar melting pot of the children of ambassadors, politicians, lawyers, immigrants, and also very far right-leaning people with a hold and a respect for and a reverence for Confederate values. I was just as likely to sit next to a kid in class who had a shotgun in their parents' car and a Confederate flag on the back window as I was to sit next to someone who looked like me. And I very much valued that experience because it created an uncommon discourse among young people where we shared very clearly and with conviction the way that really our family saw the world. It poured in through us. But my classroom experiences in what were called the honors classes in that high school, that public high school of about 2,000 students, were much different from the experiences I had in the general population. Those experiences were effectively me in a sea of the children of very liberal, upper middle class white families. And what I learned in that classroom was that in those sorts of environments, there is a power dynamic that materializes that values oftentimes things that sound right, things that sound forward-thinking, but with little space for pushback, feedback, undermining, things that generate arguments of quality. And I learned very fast that I needed to, in order to have any sort of voice in that classroom, emulate those ways of thinking and emulate those ways of even speaking, from tonality to cadence, in ways that I'm speaking right now, to have a voice there. That was tiring. And when I got too tired, I eventually just leaned back on the values that I was walking out of every day at home. And very quickly, it was decided, there was a consensus, it felt, that that voice was not valuable in the room. And it started by teachers stopped calling on me, and then it became my classmates stopped looking at me, and then I would just stand up and walk out of the room. And that became a pattern for me in high school to the point where my teachers just started leaving the door open. And I decided I want a different experience for college. So I went to a small black college in Atlanta called Morehouse, where I expected to find myself a part of the power paradigm, because everybody was going to look like me. Everybody was going to think like me, I thought. And I got there, and what I found instead was, with sort of the sheath of whiteness removed, people who I generally saw looking at the ground, speaking in mumbles, not feeling completely respected, voiced their opinions very freely. And that created a more dynamic discourse than I had ever found, even in my very mixed high school. And I think that's the experience that people find and tend to flock to in affinity groups of all kinds. Women, different religions, different sexualities, outside of the general power paradigm. This is just someone who I'm proud of, another graduate of our college, who points to his experience in that all-black community as a place where he sharpened his teeth in discourse. So leaving that experience, I was looking for a job, as someone in the last year of college is, and I thought, I want to go work somewhere where discourse is valued. I want to work somewhere where opposing opinions, ideas, convictions, business models are celebrated. And so I chose to go work at the internet. Whoops. At a place called, let's call it Moogle. Moogle said in their ethics code that their mission was to collect all the world's information and make it universally useful and accessible. To me, that speaks to mutual understanding. So I expected that at the nucleus of that company, on its headquarters in Silicon Valley, I would find those same values embodied. That company also had an ethos. It was written on the walls, it was written in the ethics code, it was written on your Google Plus. Moogle it, someone says, yes, indeed. Those last 6 words you hear before you die, right? Bring your whole self to work. So I brought my whole self to work. I asked the same questions as an adult that I asked in high school. I spoke with conviction when I had a feeling. I was pointed with my managers, always respectful, but pointed when I felt like I disagreed with something that had been said or a decision that was made, or when I felt undervalued. Very millennial of me. And what I then learned at Moogle was that there was a new power dynamic that cloaked itself in cargo shorts and indie band t-shirts that were meant to represent bringing your whole self to work, being free in your convictions, being thoughtful and outspoken about what you believed in, such that it would create the most valuable future for the company and for the world it was changing. And that was not so. In fact, what it did was it just shifted what used to be dressed up in business suits and ties into a different outfit. And it kind of looked like that. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner, I'm up there hanging out. So after hitting my head over and over and over again, trying to, again, emulate the affect, the clothes, the interests, the business leanings of my peers, and watching them be promoted, and finding myself sort of toiling in my seat, I first saw my manager start ignoring me. Then my teammates started to ignore me. So I got up and left. And where I went was to sit in front of a computer and try to find another way for somebody to hear my voice. So I wrote a story about a young black technologist trying to find his voice in Silicon Valley. Specifically, a young black entrepreneur living in Brooklyn, so not physically in Silicon Valley, who created a dating app that could read sexual chemistry. That was the story. I wrote a pilot. I signed at an agency. They told me, okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna sit you in front of a bunch of production companies. You're gonna find the one that understands your story and wants that thing to get out in the world. I thought media was the perfect place for the discourse of human differences such that we'd find mutual interest. So I went to 20 different production companies, pitched the story to 20 different white dudes, and most of them said some version of, I just don't get it. I'm sitting outside of a coffee shop one day in Brooklyn, somebody taps me on my shoulder, I turn around and it's Spike Lee. I told him I went to Morehouse, we start talking, I share the story for the screenplay. Immediately off the bat, he gets it. He's like, let's take this thing out together. Go back to the agency, they say, here's 20 networks for you to sit in front of and pitch this story with this director. Go in the room, pitch the story. One in particular, after 18 other no's, 19 other no's, says, a story about a black coding genius. That just sounds a little too unbelievable. And I'm like, you guys have a show about a woman who gives birth to dragons. And they're like, yeah, but doesn't this seem a little bit like Silicon Valley? I'm like, well, fundamentally, the show is different for this reason, and that reason, and this reason, and that reason. And they say, okay, we're interested. Maybe we'll buy a pilot, but you gotta make the main character white. I'm like, can I make it a dragon? So, I very graciously said, thanks, but no thanks. My director partner was less gracious. And we left. And I went in and pitched it one more place to Black Entertainment Television, right? Next day, they gave me an offer for the show, which I am excited about and grateful for. But this very black show, written by a very black writer, produced by a very black producer, that occurs on a very black network, is likely to reach a very black audience, which is important. My question, though, is how do we get art that is made by those with less power in front of the eyeballs and ears of people with power so that we can truly find mutual understanding? Thank you.